All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are going to be tackling some pretty intense stuff. We're going to be looking at Marine Corps Doctrinal Publication 1 to 2. And we know that you're using this episode to help get a handle on this key doctrine. So we're going to break it down. MCDP 1 to 2, it's basically the Marine Corps strategic playbook. It's all about how the Marine Corps plans and executes campaigns, those big operations, to meet top-level goals. Today, we are going to be specifically diving deep into Chapter 2, which is about campaign design.
Yeah, Chapter 2 really lays out the framework for how the Marines connect those high-level strategic goals, like national objectives, all the way down to what happens on the battlefield.
Okay, so MCDP 1-2. It starts off by talking about how military force can be used to achieve those goals. It breaks things down into two basic strategies, annihilation and erosion. And so it's choosing the right tool for the job.
Yeah, annihilation, that's that knockout punch. Aiming for a really decisive victory by totally destroying the enemy's ability to resist. Think of operations like Desert Storm. Overwhelming force led to a quick and decisive victory against Iraq. But sometimes that knockout punch isn't the best option.
That's where erosion comes in. It's more like a marathon. You're gradually wearing down the enemy's will to fight, so you're making the costs of continuing the fight too high until they just can't bear it anymore.
Right, the American Revolution, the Vietnam War, both were long, drawn-out conflicts. Wearing down the enemy's will to fight played a key role in how those turned out.
So understanding which strategy is in play is absolutely crucial. You know, if you're a Marine, it's going to shape everything about how you plan an operation, how you execute it on the ground. It's like knowing whether to train for a sprint or a marathon.
Absolutely. And it raises some important questions to think about. What are the strengths and weaknesses of each approach? How might these strategies be applied in different scenarios you might encounter? What about how the choice of strategy impacts your role? And the decisions you make on the ground?
Great questions to think about. Now, after laying out those two strategies, MCDP 1-2 goes on to talk about identifying the enemy's critical vulnerabilities. And they talk about centers of gravity.
Centers of gravity, those are the linchpins of enemy power, the things that really make them tick. There are two types. Strategic centers of gravity, these impact their overall will to fight. And then there are operational centers of gravity, which are those specific military elements that pose the biggest threat.
So it's kind of like finding the enemy's Achilles heel. What do they rely on most? What are they afraid of losing? You target those things, and it undermines their ability to fight.
Think about the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Saddam Hussein's regime relied heavily on its Republican Guard divisions for both military power and political control. So those divisions, their loyalty and effectiveness, that was a critical operational center of gravity. Coalition forces really focused on neutralizing the center of gravity to ensure a swift victory.
It makes it so much clearer. But the document also talks about critical vulnerabilities. So what are those, and how are they different from centers of gravity?
But critical vulnerability is a weakness that, if you can exploit it, will directly undermine a center of gravity. It's a chink in the armor protecting that center of gravity.
So you might not always be able to hit the center of gravity directly, but you can target a related vulnerability to weaken it. It's like cutting off the supply lines to a key enemy stronghold, rather than attacking the stronghold itself.
That's a good way to think about it. The example from the source about taking out enemy air defenses to get at command and control facilities really illustrates that point. You're not attacking the enemy's will to fight directly, but you're crippling their ability to command and control their forces, which will ultimately impact their ability to resist.
And just like we're trying to find and exploit the enemy's vulnerabilities, they're doing the same thing to us, right? Protecting our own vulnerabilities is just as important as finding theirs. It's a constant back and forth.
Absolutely. It's like a chess match. You're constantly trying to outmaneuver your opponent and anticipate their next move. And this leads us to the next big concept, the campaign concept.
Okay, so the campaign concept, that's like the big idea, the overarching plan for the entire operation.
MCDP 1-2 stresses that the campaign concept needs to be bold, focused, and creative. It's about coming up with a clear, unifying idea that guides all your actions.
So it's not just about brute force.
Yeah.
But also about outsmarting the enemy, using deception to keep them off balance.
Exactly. The source gives some great historical examples. Grant's plan in the Civil War, the island hopping campaign in World War II, the Incheon landing in the Korean War. All of these involved bold, creative concepts that took the enemy by surprise. So, for example, the Incheon landing during the Korean War, it was a daring, amphibious assault far behind enemy lines. It completely caught the North Korean forces off guard and really turned the tide of the war.
Wow, that's incredible. These examples are all large-scale operations. But the idea of a bold and creative concept, It applies at the tactical level too, right? Even if you're leading a small unit, you need to be thinking creatively. Yeah. And finding ways to outmaneuver your opponent.
Absolutely. It's about applying these principles at every level of war, from large-scale campaigns down to squad-level engagements, whether you're planning a major offensive or a small unit patrol. You need to think creatively and be ready to adapt to the situation on the ground.
So you've got this big, bold concept, but you can't just execute it all at once. That's where phasing comes in, right? You need to break it down into manageable chunks.
Right. Phasing is all about breaking the campaign down into smaller, more manageable stages that can be executed sequentially, or sometimes even simultaneously.
It's about thinking several steps ahead, just like a chess player, anticipating the enemy's reactions,
Yeah.
and planning for different contingencies.
You're exactly right. There are different approaches to phasing, too. Event-driven phasing is like playing jazz. You have a basic plan, but you're ready to improvise and change the tempo based on how the enemy reacts. You're adapting to the rhythm of the battlefield. Schedule-driven phasing, on the other hand, is more like conducting an orchestra, where precise timing and resource coordination are essential.
So you need to find the right balance between those two approaches depending on the
Yeah.
situation, right? You need to be adaptable. But you also need to ensure you have the resources and support to sustain the fight.
It all comes back to logistics, and having a clear understanding of your capabilities and limitations, you can have the most brilliant plan in the world. But if you can't sustain your forces, it's all for nothing. You need to be able to sustain those forces, which kind of leads us to this concept that MCDP 1.2 emphasizes, planning for conflict termination, right from the beginning.
Well, that's interesting. It's not just about winning the fight, but having a plan for how it ends and what comes after.
Exactly. It's about defining that desired end state. What does victory look like? And how do we transition smoothly to whatever comes next? Whether it's peacekeeping operations, humanitarian assistance, or just simply redeploying your forces.
Because you're saying it's not enough to achieve your military objectives. You also need to consider the political, social, and economic factors that are going to shape that post-conflict environment.
MCDQ 1.2 really highlights the importance of starting that planning early, from the very outset of the campaign. They also emphasize key considerations, like disengagement, force protection, coordinating with other agencies, both military and civilian, to ensure a stable transition.
That makes a lot of sense. You don't want to just stop fighting. And then have a vacuum where chaos and instability can take hold. You need to have a plan for maintaining security, providing those basic services, rebuilding infrastructure.
And this is where thinking about your potential future roles is crucial. Imagine you're leading a unit that's just completed a major combat operation. How do you go from fighting the enemy to working with local communities to rebuild their lives? How do the principles of MCDP 1.2 guide your actions in that kind of scenario?
Those are some really important questions to consider. It's a reminder that being a Marine, it isn't just about fighting battles. It's about being a peacekeeper, a humanitarian, an ambassador for the United States. Now, to illustrate these concepts, MCDP 1.2 provides some excellent case studies.
They offer a glimpse into how these principles have been applied in real-world operations and provide some valuable lessons that we can learn from.
The two case studies highlighted are the recapture of Europe in World War II and the Malayan emergency. Talk about two very different campaigns.
They really are. The recapture of Europe, that was a massive, large-scale operation. It was a classic example of an annihilation campaign with a really clear objective, the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany. It was a truly epic undertaking, with multiple phases, each building upon the previous one, all meticulously planned and coordinated to achieve that ultimate goal.
It's just a testament to the power of strategic planning, logistics, and sheer determination on an almost unimaginable scale.
It really is. Now, the Malayan emergency was a completely different kind of fight. It was a protracted counterinsurgency campaign, fought not on massive battlefields, but in the dense jungles and villages of Malaya.
So instead of facing a conventional army, the British forces were up against guerrilla fighters who blended in with the local population, making it incredibly difficult to distinguish between friend and foe.
Exactly. The British had to adapt their tactics and strategies to this very unique environment. They couldn't just rely on overwhelming force. They had to win over the hearts and minds of the local population, isolate the insurgents from their support base, and just gradually wear down their ability to resist.
It sounds like it required a completely different mindset, a deep understanding of the local culture, and a long-term commitment to achieving victory.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating is that both campaigns, despite their stark differences, they demonstrate the adaptability of those core principles of campaign design that are outlined in MCDP 1.2.
So whether you're fighting a conventional war or engaging in counterinsurgency operations. The principles remain relevant.
In both cases, commanders had to identify centers of gravity, exploit vulnerabilities, develop a clear concept, and phase their actions effectively. They also had to plan for conflict termination and the transition to a post-conflict environment.
These case studies are a powerful reminder that the principles of MCDP 1-2, they're not just abstract theories, they're proven concepts that have been applied successfully across a wide range of challenging situations.
And that's a key takeaway. They offer valuable insights for anyone involved in strategic planning and decision-making, whether in a military context or even in other fields where strategic thinking is crucial.
We've covered a lot of ground here, so let's just do a quick recap. We talked about the two main strategies of annihilation and erosion. We explored those concepts of centers of gravity and critical vulnerabilities.
We discussed the importance of a clear campaign concept, the need to phase operations effectively, and that critical aspect of planning for conflict termination.
And we looked at how these principles have been applied in real-world campaigns, highlighting the adaptability and enduring relevance of these concepts.
As you delve deeper into MCDP 1-2, keep these key takeaways in mind. Think critically about how they apply to your own training and your future roles as a Marine.
Don't be afraid to challenge assumptions. Think outside the box and develop your own innovative approaches to the challenges you face.
Because at its core, that's what MCDP 1-2 is all about. Empowering Marines at every level to think critically and act decisively to achieve their missions.
Taking ownership and applying them in a way that makes sense for your specific situation. So after all this talk about strategy and these big picture concepts, MCDP 1-2 gets down to brass tacks, the practical side. How do you actually put these ideas into action?
That's where the campaign plan comes in. It takes those sometimes abstract concepts from the campaign design and turns them into a concrete, actionable plan.
Like the roadmap for the entire operation. The plan outlines the sequence of events, the key objectives for each phase, and how all the different elements will come together to achieve those strategic goals.
And MCDP 1-2 is very specific about what makes a good campaign plan. It emphasizes clarity, conciseness, and adaptability above all else.
So it's not about creating this massive, super detailed document that tries to predict every possible scenario.
Not at all. It's about striking a balance. You know the plan needs to provide clear guidance and intent to your subordinates, while remaining flexible enough to adapt to the inevitable changes that will happen once you engage the enemy.
The document actually uses General MacArthur's famous 4-page plan for the Southwest Pacific Theater of Operations as an example of effective brevity. It's incredible to think that such a complex and vast operation could be outlined in just 4 pages.
It highlights the importance of focusing on the essentials, the core concept, the intended phases, the key objectives, and a general logistical concept to make sure that the operation can be sustained, but it also leaves room for commanders on the ground to make decisions based on the evolving situation.
So the campaign plan is a living document, constantly being assessed and adjusted based on those realities on the ground.
Think of it like a playbook for a football team. The coach lays out the game plan, but the quarterback can call audibles at the line of scrimmage based on what the defense is showing. So that plan provides the framework, but it needs to be flexible enough to adapt to the unpredictable nature of war.
That's a great analogy. Before we wrap up, I want to highlight one final point from MCDP 1-2 that really stood out to me: the emphasis on critical thinking and applying these principles at all levels of command.
Yeah, that's so important. You know, these concepts aren't just for generals planning large-scale operations. They're for every Marine, from the squad leader to the battalion commander. MCDP 1-2 is providing that framework for thinking about military operations at every level.
So as you continue your study of this document, don't just try to memorize definitions and concepts. Really think about how they apply to your own specific role and responsibilities, whether you're leading a fire team or planning a company-level operation.
Right. Challenge assumptions. Think outside the box. And don't be afraid to develop creative solutions to the problems that you encounter. That's what makes a truly effective leader, because that's what MCDP 1-2 is all about: empowering Marines to think critically, make sound decisions, and take decisive action no matter the challenge.
That's a great takeaway. So to our listener out there, we hope this deep dive into MCDP 1-2 has been a valuable resource for you. It's a challenging document, but it's essential reading for any Marine who wants to understand how the Corps operates and what it takes to achieve victory on the modern battlefield.
Remember, this deep dive is just the beginning. Continue to study, learn, and grow as a leader. Keep those core principles in mind, apply them to your training and your future operations, and never stop challenging yourself to be the best Marine you can be.
Excellent advice. And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into MCDP 1-2. We hope you found it insightful and helpful. Stay curious, keep learning, and we'll catch you on our next deep dive.